Hey, all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 24, season 2. Got a super cool episode for you all this week with Casey Piscura of Wild Mountain Seeds in the mountains of Colorado. And I should say, though we do talk a bit about seed production, Wild Mountain is also an extensive vegetable market garden. Veg makes up well over half of their sales, but I love how they've weaved seeds into their operation. It's something we've been working on our own farm, so it was definitely something I wanted to talk to him about, but especially in their extreme environment, thousands of feet above sea level, where I imagine it's probably not easy to find seeds bred for that environment. So we talk about all that. We talk about their no-till system, about bindweed, and about their lease agreement and how all that works. It's a great conversation, and I could not bring it to you without the help of our show sponsors like BCS America.
You already know about the legendary versatility of BCS two-wheel tractors on the small farm. You know it's the most economical and time-saving choice for market farmers, building beds with the rotary plow, mixing amendments with the power harrow, and mowing cover crops with the flail mower. But a BCS two-wheel tractor can do much more beyond the small farm. BCS powers more than 40 high-quality PTO-driven attachments, each with the power and performance of an all-gear drive transmission. Blow snow with BCS's snow thrower, also known as the snow cannon. Chip and shred debris with the chipper shredder. Clean your property with the pressure washer. Irrigate your lawn or garden with the high-pressure irrigation pump. Haul over 800 pounds, including yourself, with a rideable utility trailer. And now, spread compost evenly over 30-inch beds with the all-new spreader attachment. Yep, BCS is pretty much the Swiss Army knife of power equipment. Check out bcsamerica.com for the latest attachments, videos, promotions, and more. That's bcsamerica.com.
Also supporting the show this week is Growing for Market magazine.
Hi, I'm Andrew Mefford, editor of Growing for Market magazine. We're excited to be back sponsoring the No-Till Market Garden podcast, so we made a code for listeners to get 25% off any subscription. Head on over to growingformarket.com and enter the code WORM, that's WORM, for the discount. We're still on the same mission as when the flower farmer author Lynn Basinski founded the magazine 29 years ago. To be a resource written by farmers for farmers with practical ideas and information to help local farms succeed. There are a decade of back issues and articles available online, plus subscribers automatically get 20% off any of the books we sell, including the No-Till book bundle of 3 no-till books listed together at 10% off the cover price, so you can add your subscriber discount and get a total of 30% off the price of all 3. If you do farmers markets, farm stands, CSA, local wholesaling, dream of starting a no-till farm, or a little of everything, if you like what you're hearing on the podcast, go to Growing for Market and use the code WORM for 25% off any subscription.
Big thank you to our show sponsors. Links in the show notes to them. And enough from me. Let's get to our amazing conversation with Casey Piscura of Wild Mountain Seeds. Casey Piscura, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Super excited to have you. So we never quite know where these conversations will end up, but we always want to start in the same place. So tell us a little bit about where you are, the kind of acreage that you're working with there, and those sorts of things.
Sure, Jesse. So we're located in Carbondale, Colorado. It's about an hour from Aspen. It's on the western slope of the Colorado Rockies. We're farming about 3 acres in vegetables and seeds, and then managing about 20 acres of pasture land that we manage for compost making and other things. And then the ranch that we operate on is 1,200 acres, with about probably half of that being in pretty much rangeland, and some of that being in seasonally irrigated that isn't irrigated for the entire season. And of that vegetable land, we're doing about the breakdown is about 80% in market farming and 20% in seeds.
Wow. Okay. And what's the sort of history with that? That farm that you're working on? That's like multi-generational. It's been there for a long time. And then, so how did you kind of come into the picture there?
Yeah, sure. So the land actually is the longest continuously owned piece of land in our area. I was kind of working around the area, doing various things in the ski industry, kind of gardening. I have a background in agriculture from my schooling, and just heard that there was a garden up here that kind of had been someone gave it a go, and it had been kind of not so successful. So I was at the time that I was trying to shift gears and came up here, introduced myself to the landowners, and then set up a lease for that year, kind of on a trial. This was, I guess, 6 years ago, and we ran that first season super small, and they liked what they saw, and so we developed a longer-term lease that following year, and now we're working on like kind of managing some of the larger picture here, and trying to do it in a regenerative manner. Historically, this land was managed as a sheep and potato farm by kind of a famous family around the area, which a lot of the stuff around this area is named after them.
Okay, can you give us a little bit of a glimpse into how that lease works? I love the idea of having like 1 year trial period and then a longer lease. Like what's the longer lease, and then do you have like are you paying it sort of a monthly lease, or is there a trade-off, or how's that work?
Yeah, when we first started off, it was kind of, approve yourself for the year, and then what I did was basically in exchange for operating, all my, capital improvements and assets that were fixed were just traded to the ranch. So they could see the improvement in the gardens, the soil, the potential for having a longer-term vegetable production on the land, and that was kind of the return. After a couple of years, we started to shift into a percentage of our gross sales. We also, the first few years, we were either living off the land, coming out here, and then negotiated a house that we live on, and that's kind of managed in the same way, where I'm exchanging management work that's kind of outside of the gardens, such as the rangelands or the irrigatable acreage. A lot of it's irrigated, so you're moving side rolls and big guns and dams to water as kind of the exchange for operating my seed and vegetable business.
Yeah, that's super cool. I love I love the exchanges, but also just like having a little bit more security, knowing that your lease is going to be there for several years. So I kind of want to just maybe dive into these two different things that you do. You do vegetables, and well, not two, obviously you do a lot of different things, but the two main things that you do, which are vegetables and the seeds. So can we start with the veggies and talk a little bit about marketing, and then what sort of stuff you're producing, and then maybe just like how that evolved into seeds, or how the seeds come into play?
Sure. So with our vegetables, we're mainly doing market gardening. Our first couple of years, we did more of a CSA, but because it's kind of more of a private ranch, we're not, having people come out was one thing that we kind of shifted away from. So right now we're marketing the vegetables through the Aspen Farmers Market and the Salt Farmers Market. So 2 farmers markets, and then wholesale, and we work with a wholesale distributor. We're growing the typical market vegetables, most things you can think of. We do have some limitations in that we are a Zone 3 market farm, with our, last frost of the spring oftentimes being the 3rd or 4th week in June, and then our first frost in the fall landing somewhere around the 2nd week in September, or typically whenever we get a full moon in September. So that limits a lot to what we can do outside. With that said, we have a lot of greenhouse structures. I won't go into the full size, but quite a bit of greenhouse structures that we do most of our warm season crop production in. And then outside, we mainly stick to frost hardy crops, but we've also utilized our cold summer temps, and we have really high temps during the day because we're so close up to the sun. Cold temps at night that we've utilized that to try to breed our plants to better suit our environment. So when I first started out up here, I was a little bit more naive about what kind of environment I was getting into. I was kind of more romantic with the idea of having this farm where I could live close to the big mountains and go skiing. But the reality of how cold it was really set in when I was really struggling to keep my nursery even warm enough to not freeze without, spending a large amount of money trying to heat it. So we started to really get to know how to better insulate the greenhouses, how to really use thermal mass and other things to keep the greenhouses warmer. And then once we kind of grew that first year, I realized that, wow, there were a lot of crops that just could not grow fast enough to make it profitable at all here. So I started looking into genes or seeds that I was getting from local people that were growing up high in the mountains, as well as looking at seeds from Native American history, and really diving into genes that might help us, really just get to producing. And over years, we were really able to look at the crops like tomatoes and cucumbers and things, and figure out a regimen to how we can improve those for our farm. And we really started to see big changes and seeing like the plants really being able to grow a lot better at cold temps. And it's been really probably the biggest influence on our productivity over the years.
Yeah, that's cool. I saw, a market picture on your Instagram maybe, where you had these, kind of pretty looking tomatoes. And I was thinking like, that's gotta be a real challenge. So for you, it kind of starts with finding the right seeds and then you're like, what does that process of development sort of look like in terms of maybe tomatoes? I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, tomatoes is really a passion of mine, and I've really learned from a lot of kind of the breeders of our time. Dr. Alan Capular of Peace Seeds, Carol Deppy, who wrote the book Breed Your Own Vegetable Varieties, as well as like other folks that are using what's called land racing. But just to kind of start with tomato, one thing we would look for people with similar climates, but then we also started with what's called land racing, and what we would do is collect as many different genetics of the particular type of tomato that we wanted to grow. So let's say black tomato. And we would get, the Cherokee purple strain from 3 different people, and as many black crim strains and strains that we could find through Seed Savers Exchange, and get as much different that we could fit in our contest space as we could. And in that first season, plant all those different ones out. And then we have a system of breeding where we kind of focus on certain times of the year to do collections. One that we find really kind of important is the first fruits. We can look at one. Oftentimes the soil temps are colder there in the spring, and we can see, well, this plant was able to get the fruit first. That would be a good trait, as well as kind of understanding. We kind of believe that perhaps the genetic memory of the plant is best represented. Like if the plant wants to remember the spring, if we collect the first fruit, does it, remember spring better? So we started to look at that time, and then in the middle of the year we would look at overall productivity, crack resistance, fruit quality, And then again at the end of the year, with a similar concept of understanding of the spring being the first fruit, we kind of could see which of the plants could really have that longevity, no disease resistance, or no disease was present, showing immunological response or disease resistance, and really then we could see frost on the other side and see if any plants were doing better at frost, and those kind of combinations over a bunch of years really improved the genes overall.
Yeah, that's cool. I love the idea of just getting absolutely as much genetic diversity as possible, growing that out and seeing what responds well, and then narrowing that down. Is that kind of the process?
Yeah, that's kind of the process. Also, within that, kind of how we did it was we would plant out a lot more plants than we need and then look for vigor in the seedling stage. What that can mean is, one, they're kind of coming right off faster, so it's giving you like a sign of maybe more heterozygosity, which could also be known as hybrid vigor. So a lot of our like heirloom tomatoes or plants that are typically inbreeding crops, especially within heirlooms, they may have inbred for so long they're starting to lose vigor. When you land race the crop, if you mix up kind of those different strains, you've got different genetic makeups across the row there. What happens is after collecting from the best plants of that first season, you can plant out the next year and really pay attention to that early vigor. And that early vigor can kind of show the crosses that happened of the previous year. So in that year we would find those crosses and then plant those out, which came from the best fruits of those 3 times. The next year do the same thing, which would create ultimately more vigor. If we're finding the hybrids, we're then creating hybrids in the first year and then hybrids of hybrids the following year. We continue to do this for many years. We start to kind of expand the genome and create more heterozygosity in typical inbreeding plants, such as tomatoes, which increases their vigor. Another thing we started to mess around with was, what if we ran some environmental stress trials on the young seedlings? A few years ago, I think 3 years ago, I kind of had the wild idea to start force frosting the populations. And so we were dropping the plants down into the high 30s and watching to see what survivors we had. About 1,000 little baby seedlings, kind of all jammed together on one tray. And then we would get some die off there, but not to the numbers that we really liked, because I had too many plants that were surviving at the time. So we then dropped the temps way low, getting down to like 26 or so degrees. And surprisingly enough, on that tomato tray, we got about 80 survivors. When we planted those out, we started to find, wow, these, they also have that heterozygotic trait in that it seems that they have good response to climatic stresses, because they were crosses of and thus had more were less inbred and had more of this climatic resistance.
That's super cool. I love this too, because I'm thinking about, you're doing these tomatoes and you're doing all these trials, but then during the season you're probably just selling the tomatoes that you're growing, right? Like it's 2 crops in one, and you're also developing it simultaneously. Would that be accurate, or are these 2 separate things?
Yeah, that's kind of it. I'll have some outdoor trials that are more like focused on the breeding, but for the most part, we're planting these, our superstar varieties that we plan to save seed of, and they're going to market, and we just kind of are focus on is like to not miss a gem. So to kind of dig a little bit deeper when we're harvesting. I typically do the tomatoes mainly myself because I'm like doing more of the breeding as opposed to our apprentices or employees. And just I've got a little, flag on my or little ribbons on my belt loop, and I'm when I see something that I think is special, I'm flagging it. So, it's been a good way for us to like add another dimension to our farm because it's just such a short season. It's difficult to bring in enough revenue, but being able to kind of do the breeding alongside of the market farming, which is much easier to get going and get revenue into the farm. It kind of works really beautifully because we're starting to get more and more recognition with the seeds now, and seeing that really show benefit to farmers all over the country, and we've been able to build that organically, which is nice because now we're getting like seed sales in the early spring where we often struggle to get working capital.
Interesting. I've never thought about seeds as being like something that you could be selling over the winter months, but of course they are, right? I mean, right now it's January and we're all buying seeds. So, yeah, that's a pretty interesting thing to think about as a potential capital boost. The one thing technical that I'd be curious to know is, are the majority of your tomatoes being grown undercover, or are you growing a lot in the field?
Majority of our tomatoes are being grown undercover for production. As soon as you put tomatoes out in the field, we're growing at 6,400 feet. So when you go outside, you've got a heavy load of sunlight. So sun scald is a really tough issue. As well as if I really time it well. I mean, I'm transplanting tomatoes under remay with drip underneath where it's going to frost them 10 plus times, or more while they're under there, just to get 2 good flushes out of it. And so we mainly go in the greenhouse because we don't get any sun scald, and we're getting a lot higher soil temps to make it work a lot better as far as a profitability standpoint. So most of our outdoor grows look more from a breeding standpoint, but within the indoor production, we're mainly growing all heirlooms, and we're growing them vertically, but with a different kind of trellis system than I've seen most people do.
In terms of, all right, so we talked about a crop that you can kind of both harvest from and collect seed from. What about something that is, when you grow it, you can only get the seed? Are you doing a lot of those kind of crops, or are you kind of focusing on the crops that you can both get a marketable crop from during the season and also save the seed from? Does that make sense? Like, I think of things like beets. You have to leave the beet in the ground to be able to get the seed from it. So can you talk about some of those other crops are you doing those?
Yeah, we are. They're a little bit more in kind of longer term development as the return is at least, within the biennials, it takes a lot longer to get the return. So let's say carrots, what we're doing with the carrots is, we're planting out a large amount, and then within like kind of our wash and pack and sort on certain times, we're not doing this all the time because it becomes kind of a pain to do it. We're kind of, coming into like our winter storage carrots when we're kind of steckling the tops for winter storage. We're just putting aside the best roots, and those go out to be planted out for seed the next year. So that's kind of how we do those. And there's some crops that we're just doing specifically for seed, whether it be kale or something that, but we try to get some market value out of it too, just because we're a small farm, and we also, we don't have the best seed climate ever, just because of like overwintering pressures with it getting really cold. So tend to, we're slowly developing more of that, learning how to like insulate the soil with leaves and things. But yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that's great, because that's kind of my thing. Is I think that as market growers, we're often like, okay, we're either growing vegetables or we're growing seeds. And so I'm always looking for ways, or people who are using techniques to do both simultaneously, or what they do when they are growing a crop that is only a seed crop. And no, I mean, that definitely answers my question. I think that's really cool.
Hey, you all, just jumping in real quick to talk about some events where you can catch me this year. So far in person, I will be in San Diego, obviously, this upcoming weekend, February 15th, 2020, with Jared Smith of Jared's Real Food and Stephen Cornett of Nature's Always Right for a no-till intensive there. Josh Satin is coming along with me to do some filming. Learn more about that event at no-tillgrowers.com/events. I will also be at the Oak Conference here in Louisville. That's how it's pronounced. We kind of disregard all the consonants. That'll be on March 7th in 2020, doing a talk there on no-till production, obviously. This is one of my favorite conferences every year, so I hope you'll check that out. Learn more at oak-ky.org. Also, just announcing today that Connor Crickmore has invited me up to Neversink Farm to do a no-till intensive up there with him at Neversink Farm, which is going to be super cool in New York. This will be on May 17th, 2020. That is a Sunday. It will be awesome. There will be some lunch and then drinks after the event. Links all in the show notes and at no-tillgrowers.com. Other than that, back to Casey.
Can you talk a little bit more about marketing them? Is the majority of it sold online, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's been mainly it. And, I feel like we're just now kind of cresting out. I've got some seeds out into some larger trials, but when you work on like trying to breed a variety, and whether you're patenting it or whatever, kind of working with these other larger seed companies, we've been kind of, as we started to learn that just from working with our local friends that are market farming around here, and them growing our tomatoes versus some of the, more expensive varieties that you can get from the bigger seed, is that we've started to recognize that there is a lot of potential within what we're doing. It's kind of like, a bike racer might come up to the mountains to train to get stronger so they can go race, down in a lower elevation. It seems to be similar things happening within the vegetables. So right now, almost all of our stuff is going through our website, but we're also kind of exploring working with some of the other bigger seed companies as like either breeding the variety and them growing it out in a lower, warmer place, or doing that seed grow out ourselves.
Yeah, that's neat. And then, have you all? How many varieties of seed are you selling at the moment, would you say?
I think we have like probably 70 or so. So I think a lot different than maybe your typical seed company is that we're kind of more of a focused on breeding than we are in just growing something to grow seed of it. We're really trying to like improve our varieties. And so I think our market farming focus really helps us in that manner, because it's about, we're not trying to grow seed for money. We're trying to grow like seed to better our market farming. And then if it organically moves in that manner, then great. That's kind of how we approach seed growing. Keeping our overhead low.
Right. Okay, so we can maybe get back to the seeds in a minute, because I want to kind of hear a little bit about your no-till practices. Before we started talking, you said that you've kind of been no-till since the beginning. So can you kind of describe what that looks like, and maybe just describe your system a little bit?
Sure. So we're really about, I think, about trying to make market farming, seed growing very regenerative, and no-till is attractive from the start, because I kind of have a permaculture background as well. And so, when we start beds, we're working on what was perennial pasture out here. It does have a lot of quackgrass and problematic stuff like that, but we typically just use tarps to shade out, because it's such a strong stand of quackgrass. We'll typically do that for anyway up to like 6 months, really to get like everything there. Before we tarp it, we'll use a subsoiler, either yeoman's plow, or we've used a ripper on the back of actually just we have like a dozer, and do that on like 6 inches on when it's like really kind of dry, and then from there coming in with the initial compost, and we're laying that down 2 to 4 inches, about 2 inches, probably more. We struggle up here because we do not have a great source of compost. Compost can be very expensive, like in the range of, for stuff that you can guarantee doesn't have persistent herbicides in it, upwards of like $180 a yard. So,
Wow.
so that's limiting, which has been, I think, good for me because I kind of worked a strategic partnership with a soil company out here called the Paonia Soil Company, and they do really living mixes, and that's helped us because I've kind of repped their product to keep my overhead low. Kind of like I get the rep price on some of their products in compost, which has helped bring that down. But then we've really had to focus on like, how do we grow the fertility in place? And that's been a big part of ours, is like kind of focusing on like, how do we market farm and care for the soil without having like this huge demand on getting, this crazy amount of compost all the time. And so just now we're kind of getting settled into, we do have the advantage of having quite a lot of space. And so where we're trying to settle in where we have one block kind of out for the year growing in cover crop mix, a diverse mix of things, which peas, fava beans, wheat, rye, really like it's like 7 or 8 species, and then kind of cutting that down at first flower, and then taking that out for a season so that we then can come back in the next season and kind of regenerate the soil that way, rather than kind of having always supply everything they need on like a constantly, pressured, multiple crops per year, every year scenario.
Okay, that's cool. There's a couple things in there I kind of want to touch on. So the first thing is the subsoiling. I think that one of the more overlooked qualities in starting a no-till garden is whether or not your soil is compacted. And that depends on a lot of factors. But getting that initial chance for roots to actually get in there, I think, is wildly important and maybe underutilized, because that's going to get you to soil building much faster if you're not starting out with extremely compacted soil. The other thing is the idea of the access to compost, like wanting to sort of use that system, but not having the access to compost. I mean, it's not just you all, although those prices are crazy. That's not just you all. Like there are a lot of places throughout the country, especially in rural America, that don't have great access to compost. So, with the cover, so my question in all this is you talked about that like sort of 7 or 8 species cover crop. Once that's established, how are you dealing with that to turn it into another crop?
Yeah, I mean, so it depends on the so usually that's a full season crop, and then it's gone, and And then at first flower, we're kind of trying to like cut it at first flower to kind of lay down the stuff on the surface and get as many of the kind of those rotations as possible through the season. And then coming into winter, we'll just leave it standing. It'll winter kill here if it's mature, and then we cover it with the tarp the next spring as early as we can to come back in the crop the following year. So that's one thing. We also utilize, and I think if your listeners are familiar with Bob Kennard and some of what he talks about in growing cover crop to full dry bean maturity, where there's dry bean or dry grain. We've been utilizing that quite a bit, and in particular in growing a lot of our cover crop seed. So especially within fava beans and peas, and then we also utilize this kind of system in the greenhouse that I'd love to talk about, where we'll actually, incorporate it in our rotation, grow peas for like picking fresh peas, and then once it gets to a certain amount where the peas are just kind of overwhelming and they're starting to dwindle, we'll just let them go to dry pea. And seemingly after you do that, it just creates this like durable, slow release nitrogen the following year, and we've been able to grow great crops if we're able to control the weeds in between, with basically little or no fertility added. Okay,
so wait, you're allowing those peas, the rest of those peas, to sort of dry totally, so you have a viable seed there, and then you're just leaving it to reseed, or you're harvesting all that? I feel like I missed that part.
Yeah, so then we harvest the seed, and then we can use that to replant the next year. And then the plants are just kind of like spent. Our idea is it's kind of like natural succession. If the peas were left there and we didn't harvest them, they would grow and grow and grow until they kind of set all their beans, and then they would dry down. And in that dry down process, I've kind of always wondered, like, what's going on with all the nutrients that the plant has inside of it. And I kind of think that perhaps it's just being released through the roots, so that when the seeds that would be existing there drop to the ground, they would have the full essence and nutrition that was left over from its parents. And so we feel that working that into the rotation really is amazing, and we've started to do this some in a rotation in our greenhouses, particularly using pole beans, and seeing following crops where I've got a tomato crop in here that we grew with no added compost, and it was transplanted in March, and we were harvesting tomatoes on Christmas Day with no added fertility the whole season, and that was following a pole bean that we picked until we couldn't reach anymore and let it dry down for seed.
Okay, so you're taking those legumes, you're letting them get all the way mature, you're harvesting that seed, and then you're planting generally something else in those spots. Would that be accurate?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and then often we'll clean cultivate or something in a manner of like either stale seedbed with a tarp, just to like kind of clean it out, because sometimes when they do go to seed there, you do have some pressure and have to pay attention to your weed seeds and your weeds in there, because not only is your seed crop there growing to full maturity, so is everything else.
Okay, and with that dry down, all that stubble that would be presumably left, you're not mowing that or anything, you're just kind of raking that aside, or?
Yeah, we do have a flail mower. Sometimes we'll flail it, but you'd be surprised. After a winter here, there's not a whole lot of carbon seemingly left above the surface. It'll throw down a nice little light mulch after flail mowing it, but we pretty much leave everything standing and don't flail anything coming into winter. It seems to help really regenerate that soil a lot better than flailing it down when it's green and alive in the fall.
And then one thing you mentioned earlier, sort of in that vein, was the sort of overwinter cover crop. So you have this cover crop established, and then you're kind of sort of just clipping it throughout the season, right? Which is, kind of like an animal would maybe, and convincing it to do a little bit more photosynthesis, put deeper roots down and keep growing, which is a cool idea. I think that people should utilize that more because it's just emulating animals. But then the winter, you're allowing it to kind of mature back and then winter kill. So that winter kills, so the winters are harsh enough there that they're able to kill things like rye.
Yeah, and I think that it's also dependent on the maturity of the rye,
Right.
Like if you were having baby rye sown in the fall, it would be able to overwinter. But seemingly because it's kind of like an exhausted, larger grown rye, we've seen that it seemingly will winter kill pretty good. And then the tarping is coming up after that, so that gives it, we can get a month of tarping and get everything cleaned that way.
Okay, cool. So in the spring, you're pulling a tarp over top of those, I'm assuming after snow melt. And then...
Yeah, exactly. And this is, usually in, as soon as we can. It's usually March that we start to have, the soil back exposed.
Right, and you're pretty much, that snow is pretty much there from what, October through October to March? It's like completely covered?
No. So the thing is we get really cold, but we're in a lower valley, so we have like a massive, 13,000 foot peak like right next to us. So like the cold air sinks down and kind of blankets over the ground like syrup kind of coming down every night. But we're low enough where we don't get the crazy depths of snow. So, our annual rainfall is just 16 inches a year. So like we typically don't get snow really covering the ground regularly until November. And then it typically starts to be exposed again there. And like maybe late February, it's been a little warmer than on record. Late February to early March, we can start getting stuff in. And actually, I'm going out there and starting to sow stuff like carrots and those things at this time.
Right. And then one thing that you mentioned, and I'm curious if there are other ways in which it affects your growing. You mentioned the sun scald on the tomatoes, which is, we live in Kentucky, and the sun is extremely intense here, but I wouldn't have thought about that with Colorado, but it makes sense because you're much higher altitude. What are some other issues with that kind of intense sunlight? Are there others?
Yeah, well, it gets extremely hot. So where we may only have a few days over 50 degrees at night during the summer. Last year I think was our coldest year, and I believe it only hit over 50 at night 3 or 4 days all summer long. On that same day, it can be 105 degrees because the sun is so intense. So we just have these massive swings in temperature that make things really difficult for plants because they're struggling to get a lot of photosynthesis going through the middle of the day because of the heat, and then at night they're kind of like struggling as well. It creates advantages within some of the leafy green crops that kind of like it. But yeah, there's a ton of challenges to that experience for a number of species.
So then are you, like here in Kentucky, let's say we're growing lettuce in the middle of the summer, we'll often mist it several times just to kind of cool the plant down. Are you having to actively do things for your plants to cool them down? Or, in the middle of the summer, or also occasionally just throw cover over them on colder nights? Like, how active is your participation in that part of it?
Yeah, every last bit of our farm is irrigated regularly, and so we've got we use the wobbler kind of on head-to-head spacing, so kind of as late as we can in the day before the heat of the day kicks off, we'll like throw our last bit of water down. Typically through the middle of the day, we find that if we can avoid watering, the plants kind of hunker down a lot better. They don't like open their stomates because you're watering, if that makes sense. And then they kind of like, as soon as it gets past that heat of the day, into 4 o'clock or so, then they start kind of regrowing a lot better. And we're hoping for some shade or something, or a cloud in between there. But we don't typically water the plants during the day, because with our sun extremes, we can get little like almost like burn marks where the water like concentrates the sunlight and makes little like pock marks on the plants.
Are you also having to, we just, like in Kentucky, water's not so much of an issue. We have a ton of it. We got 70 plus inches of rain last year. Or no, this past year it wasn't quite that much, but the year before it was 70 plus inches. So water's in pretty good supply here. But it's not so much in Colorado, generally speaking, but you're up in the mountains. And so in terms of water usage, are you kind of restricted in those terms also?
Yes and no. One of the beauties of our relationship is that we were able to lease land on very historic water rights. So basically there's certain water drainages that have a hierarchy of usage. And if you have the oldest deed on the water, then you get the rights in times of drought. So that's a beautiful kind of thing for us, in that even on the driest of years, we still have rights to this ditch. We did kind of run into an issue on a historic drought a couple years ago. I think you guys spoke of this a little bit with Tierra Vida Farm, where we almost didn't have water coming down out of the mountains that year. So it came to a point where even the rivers didn't have much water, but we were still able to survive during that year. So we're kind of creating more contingency on what we can do from a storage standpoint, but there's a lot of kind of bureaucracy to move through on like laws against being able to store water over 72 hours.
Right. That seems like there's a lot of places out west where water rights are a big issue. And in fact, I saw the documentary How We Grow, and you were in it, and Christian and Harper from Two Boots, and several other really great growers in the Rolling Fork Valley, and I definitely recommend that to the listenership. It's so good. But one of the things I saw was like some of the really interesting infrastructure kind of surrounding the water, and you mentioned that, you touched on that just earlier. Can you kind of describe how that water comes out of the mountains and then how it's sort of collected and distributed?
Sure, yeah. So, we, in the spring, most of our waterfalls is snow here, and in the winter, and so in the spring, the rivers are raging, and then all of them are divided out on irrigation ditches off of these main rivers. Streams and creeks all have little diversions. These diversions then go into ditches that kind of keep the water high on the landscape, and then are distributed out amongst all the farms and ranches of the West. And there's also some larger reservoirs that then are managed as irrigation or water companies that people have different stakes to, and it's all kind of governed based upon each ditch's kind of group of folks that decide based on this water law how it's used, and also like whether. So then once the water drops down to the summer flow, then basically things start. That's when people start to make what's called a call on the ditch. And how that would work, say that the most senior water rights was further down the ditch and they weren't getting their flow, they'll make a call and everybody else has to turn their water down so that they get their allotted first.
Wow, yeah, it's definitely significantly different from from what we deal with. But I guess another question I have sort of about that area is farming growing there? Like, are there a lot of people doing sort of larger scale growing in terms that would use a lot of that water? Is that still robust there, or is that kind of dying back a little bit?
Well, I think, yeah, I would say that there's a lot of energy towards local food and figuring out how to grow it. I think the difficulty and the limitations within land prices and all that are kind of stifling what we know is like of farming when it comes to like, you know, doing market gardens and these types of things. Ranching is kind of more of, you know, what would be agriculture in the area, of which is mainly cattle, but it's kind of starting to be where, you know, cattle, it's harder to make a dollar doing cattle, and a lot of these big ranches are turning more into just second homes for wealthy folks, and then they're, you know, managing it for agriculture in a certain manner, but, you know, kind of typically that is to lease it out to be grazed. But it also makes for a lot of opportunity for people to come in. We're just kind of always going to be limited by, can we make enough money in a short climate? And that's where we really struggle, because it's just everything is more expensive to create here. And, you know, when you have that much less of a growing season, you got to make your income in a shorter amount of time, which can be difficult, but we do get really good dollar value for a lot of our stuff selling to some of these high-end markets.
Right. Can you talk a little bit, if you're willing to, talk a little bit about the amount of money you're able to gross there? I mean, given your short season, but also kind of balancing that with like, aspen, snowmass. I don't know where all you sell, but you've got definitely a lot of market there. So what, can you give us a little idea of what you're able to gross in that sort of environment?
Yeah, we're doing like, I think we're doing about 120,000 between all the outlets, maybe about 130,000 once all the things are said and done. So, you know, I'd say that's pretty good for our area, but, you know, it's just a really expensive area code. So, you know, everything from a living standpoint, getting work done on a vehicle, or getting anybody to work for less than, you know, $15 an hour is incredibly difficult around here.
Yeah, there's a lot of factor. I mean, everything is more expensive. My mom moved us up there to Aspen when I was really young, and we didn't have a lot of money, but we ended up living in Aspen. But the thing I remember about it was that we couldn't. We were basically like ski bums. But it was great. It was a blast. But the thing is, the thing that I always remember is just how expensive every single thing was. Except for getting around. They had a nice transportation system. But I remember how expensive just like getting a pack of gum was, or going out and just getting like a cheaper Mexican meal or whatever it was. It was wild. It was wild. So I imagine when you extrapolate that out to farming, that you have fuel is more expensive. Like you said, compost is more expensive. Getting stuff, all of your amendments and things there. I mean, I imagine that adds up. So like so factoring that into what you're making and trying to simplify it probably becomes a high priority.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, we're starting to actually do a lot of our own compost making. So how we're doing that is kind of, we've got 20 acres to pasture out here, and we're haying the first cutting, which is a mix of grass and legume, mainly alfalfa and clover, and then kind of combining that with a second cutting that is mainly alfalfa, and that seems to get the C to N ratio about right. And then we'll combine that with kind of an old, slower compost that we keep kind of in more of an indigenous area, kind of like in the leaf litter along the creek where we feel has really good indigenous microflora, and then use that to inoculate our piles, and then trying to create kind of our bulk carbon additives that way, turning those piles once or twice or three times, and kind of utilizing pasture land to make our compost.
One thing that you'd mentioned earlier, and I kind of just want to get back to this real quick while I'm thinking of it, is you'd mentioned when we were talking about seeds, you'd mentioned patents. What is your sort of take on that? And are you exploring seed patents?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of more along the thoughts that genetics and plants should be free to everyone. So I think that patents are kind of a poor, that we shouldn't be looking at being able to patent life. With that said, I think there's absolutely a kind of unwritten rules around respect for genes and giving credit where credit's due when you're working in this stuff. And so we kind of we believe in the open source seed initiative's pledge on kind of allowing everybody to utilize any of our genetics the way they want.
Okay, and then is there like are you having to navigate patents when you're developing seeds?
We're, for the most part, we're avoiding using genetics that are from patented varieties. So for the most part, we're working with small independent breeders on finding genetics, and that's doing us really well so far. And for the most part, I think that there's definitely some PVPs and things of that nature that could be good genetic parents, but we just kind of avoid that just to make sure that we're not setting ourselves up for trouble.
Yeah, right. Is it? I mean, that's something that I always think about, like in terms of, maybe somebody wants to save their own seed, and I talked to Dan Breezebois about this a little bit, but just there's a sort of daunting nature to it where you don't really want to end up in a situation where you're saving seed and selling seed, and then you find out that you've like breached some PVP or whatever it is, like you've breached some patent. What sort of advice do you have in that regard? Like getting started selling the seeds and then feeling confident in what you're doing, or going about it in a way that, like you said, there's this sort of unwritten rule of like giving credit where credit's due. Like, what are your sort of guidelines there?
Yeah, so I mean, basically just doing, I guess the guidelines are doing your homework on what you're starting with to save the seeds of, and I think sometimes it's maybe difficult to find out if there is genetic patents on or PVPs on the things, but just like, for the most part, I guess I'm kind of trying to answer this question the same way I answered the previous question. But yeah, we're just trying to do what you can to ensure that the seed that you're going to save does not have a patent on it. With that being said, you can, sometimes you think about like a genome is constantly shifting and changing. It's kind of preposterous to like put a patent on it, kind of like corn. How many, thousands and thousands of years did it take to breed corn to what it is now? You change one gene and then you say, oh, nobody can utilize that.
Right. I guess maybe I realize those questions are very similar, but the kind of way I wanted to push it was a little bit of like, where are you looking for those details? Like, what are you specifically, like on a technical level, where are you going to kind of find that information about, if certain seed is, where it comes from, who bred it, and like who you should be giving credit to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be very difficult to find that information. Like, if I'm buying a seed from a company, I'm like kind of looking, okay, is there a PVP on it? Is there usually kind of looking from who I'm purchasing it from for the information. And then if it's like, okay, I should flag this variety as something that I shouldn't use because of what it seems to have based on the seed company that I'm buying it from. You can then, if you're really like, I gotta have this variety in my breeding program, look into the Patent and Trade Office, and there's databases on PVP that you can look to see when it expires and different things of that nature. But that typically isn't our approach.
Hey, you all, last interruption for me. You know the Patreon page at this point, patreon.com/farmerjesse. You know that is how we keep this show going and growing. It's extremely important to our work, and we appreciate everyone who kicks in a few bucks every month. And there are discounts to events and merch and stuff over there. If you don't like Patreon, you can always kick us a few bucks over at Venmo to @NoTillGrowers. That's our handle, if people still call them that. Just to say thanks. Either way, your contributions are so important to what we do, and we appreciate them dearly, so much so that at certain levels of patronage on the patreon.com/farmerjesse page, we give you a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Diggin' It Farm, Nye Ranch, Clara Coleman, JM Fortier, Weaver Acres, and Casey is a patron too. So shout out to Wild Mountain Seeds. Big thank you to everyone who supports the show. We really appreciate it. We understand that you're farmers and that you don't have a lot of extra money, and this keeps us able to bring you more information about what you do. So we really appreciate that. Other than that, you all, thank you. Back to Casey.
So let me ask you this. I haven't been asking this question for the last couple months, and I've just kind of let it go, but I think it's a really great question. In terms of some of the stuff you've tried, since you've been trying all these different, I'm going to switch gears here for a second, but trying all those kind of these different no-till systems, and you've set it up, and you're limited by your compost and stuff. Is there anything that you've tried that didn't work that you think others could learn from?
I mean, there's been a lot that kind of hasn't worked per se, but I'll start with I think the biggest lesson we learned was that when we came in and first set up the beds that we had originally, there was like all this quackgrass, and we were like, oh, what if we add some compost and then till it? This was like in the original small, I think it was like we had a 1/4 acre at the time. And till that area, and hopefully that quackgrass will kind of compost in the soil and be okay the following year. But what happened for us was it just it chopped it up into a million pieces, so we had all these different rhizomes throughout the growing area. But also what we found that, not only was the tillage bad from tearing up all the fungal networks and all of that, creating kind of also like a much more compacted situation, but also that it seemed to scoop up all the bindweed seeds. And what we found now that by never tilling it, we don't use a rotary plow or anything. We just kind of like do that rip, tarp it, and then come back in and broad fork the beds after we kind of run over them with our tractor, because we're using tractor spacing for undercutter bars and these types of things. And then we'll use like a surface a power harrow set on 2 to 4 inches, that if we never use anything that brings up the lower portion of the soil, we don't see bindweed ever. It's seemingly all buried. So the biggest thing, mistake was using that tiller to start. From now on, we'll never use a traditional tiller ever.
Interesting. So in those plots that you originally tilled, are you still battling the bindweed?
We are, and it's so persistent. It even persists under occultation, really strong. So So, it's like we're even considering when people are doing the broad fork, we're kind of like more just wiggling it. We've actually used potato forks too because we can kind of move faster and not step on the beds rather than broad forking. But like really ensuring that everybody knows, like, don't bring the fork all the way down and bring up those potential weed seeds that are buried down in the lower strata of the soil.
Yeah, and are they generally germinating down there? I mean, are you getting like new growth of bindweed generally in your no-till patches, or are they in the ones that you didn't start with tillage? Like, is that something that comes up frequently, or is that just kind of occasionally you'll see some bindweed? Or
it's like almost non-existent, or occasionally here and there. Where it seems to be pulled up by the undercutter bar or pulled up by some of the other, tillage practices that we use mainly in harvesting or in aerating with the broad fork. But yeah, basically if we maintain, a strict no, nothing coming up from down deep, we don't see the bindweed at all. Meanwhile, we're, as our soil's gotten better and continued no-till in the first plots, it's kind of starting to it's almost like gone away, as if the soil is like matured and the bindweed is not as happy with it, being more fungal.
Right, because that's what you hear, is that a lot of these weeds do not like, more fungally balanced soils, that they prefer bacterially dominated soils, which are often pasture land that's freshly turned in, or that sort of thing. So yeah, that it makes sense, but it's cool to hear it actually working in practice.
Yeah, you stick with it, and that whole idea of like a balanced C/N ratio, I'm a firm believer in that. And that, a lot of like, I think, when I was on the smaller acreage, we were really about double, triple cropping the beds, and now we've kind of moved into like, if I'm on my second crop of whatever it was, say it was, carrots and then lettuce, on that second planting, I'll undersow the lettuce with fava beans, peas, oftentimes sunflower, and wheat or rye, and I can get 2 cuttings off a transplanted lettuce, 2 or 3 cuttings, and then all the cover crop comes up underneath it, and that helps evolve the soil as it winter kills there on the bed. But it also gives us a period where we're always kind of keeping the soil covered with something. And so we're never really like exposing the beds. And we're also looking at like, okay, well, how much market gardening is starting to become detrimental to the soil, and how much do we need to like, kind of implement either growing a dry bean or a seed crop for the soil balancing, or taking time away from constant cropping to like, help rebuild the soil.
Right, that's great. What are you using that? How are you using that undercutter bar?
So we'll use it mainly for carrots. So yeah, we're on tractor spacing. We were on 30-inch bed spacing. We switched to tractor spacing. Just for speed and efficiency, and we're just using that. Sometimes on the carrot bar, I'm experimenting with running it through before I plant, so it kind of like gets a groove, I feel, of like where it's going to go. I'm still balancing like how deep to set it. But yeah, basically using it mainly for carrots. So we run underneath there and we can just yank the carrots out a lot faster, because we're not really laying out a super ton of compost. We do have quite a bit, we have a heavy kind of clay soil, so roots like that can really be difficult to pull out at a high speed without the undercutter bar.
Right, and with that clay soil, you're often dealing with some amount of compaction as well.
Right, and it's pretty compact starting off, and that's when I've been realizing that even though it's a high upfront cost for like the initial conditioning, whether it be with a lot of compost or also we've explored using peat moss, it pays you back tenfold versus just trying to work on with that clay soil, because we also struggle with capping of the soil after that, just because it doesn't have enough organic matter in it.
Right, and by capping, you kind of mean like a sort of crust on the top, or what do you mean by capping?
You water, and then the sun bakes it and kind of keeps the water from infiltrating smoother in. And that's why we're using those wobblers if we're in overhead, because it's just such a soft water. It just doesn't really like splatter the soil out at all and cause problems within compaction of that surface layer. Because, when you have that intense sun and very little rainfall, you can really turn your soil into concrete pretty fast if you don't have the organic matter right.
Right. I mean, that area, like, especially when you get down into the plains, so some amount of similar soil and some amount of similar sunlight, but, you end up in deserts. And, it's got to be managed with living plant roots and plant cover. I think that's a good place to be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's essential. I mean, keep the soil covered. That's our number one. So we're always figuring out how we can do that, whether it be, at the worst with just a tarp or, ag compost, but at the best trying to make sure we have living plants over the soil all the time. We're doing really interesting things where we're like if I'm coming into like usually right about now I'll starting lettuces and things to go in there in our house or in our we have a really warm nursery. It's really small. And then when I go out into the field, I'm like undersowing the lettuces with fava beans and peas, and oftentimes cilantro and other things. This could also be kale or this type of stuff. And so then it grows up, matures. We're getting a few cuttings, and then that fava beans and peas are our main mix, and cover crop will get nearly knee or thigh high before the warm season crops are ready to go in. And it really gives us a lot of biomass that we then take out, and it kind of is like also like the inoculum of the compost with that kind of indigenous to our greenhouse soils. But it like starts fixing up nitrogen, and then we'll clip that off right at the ground, and then not till that at all. Sometimes we'll add a little bit of compost and then transplant into that. But we're utilizing that kind of planting cover crop in existing standing crop all over the place, as well as like overwintering. So if I'm coming into the fall and I've got a fall winter, crop like spinach or lettuce or arugula, again, I'm like undersowing those fava beans, peas. Oftentimes, if I feel I need more carbon, wheat, rye, and utilizing those in the greenhouse, which has been great because I'm almost able to grow a cover crop over winter to rebuild the soil because I'm pretty much constantly cropping these greenhouses, which is awesome. And we're trying to settle into a rotation where we utilize, one year I'll do that early spring greens crop. I get my fava beans and peas. These are edible. And I'll get the peas will start firing off on that same row that was lettuce. And then we're harvesting those, and then we'll harvest those until the fava beans start, and we'll harvest the fava beans. These are all in the same rows, about 6 or 12-inch spacing. And then once those are kind of like petering out, we'll cut those down low and plant pole beans because we kind of struggle to get good pole beans outside, but our market, it's not really a profitable crop for us. But when you look at the evolution of the soil and the need for some kind of rest in the greenhouse from like continuously cropping, well then so we had lettuce, undersowed peas and favas, pick the peas. We have super early peas people love. Then we have the early fava beans in the same bed, and then clip that at the ground, sow in pole beans, grow those up, pick the pole beans until they're too high, let that go to full dry bean maturity. And then the next year I can basically grow a full tomato crop all year, no added fertility.
Wow, that's cool. I love that. I love the idea of we've been trying to do it more and more too. It's just like when it makes sense, like get a cover crop under the crop that's coming out. And this is, I always think of, I was calling it the everbed system for a while, where you're always putting, as much as you can, you're putting the next crop into the growing, you're putting the subsequent crop into the preceding crop as much as you can, so you get it established before the other one comes out. And that could be a cover crop, and I think that's how it should be. Like, I want next year, our plan is to sow every bed and pathway to a cover crop right at the end of the summer. Basically, like at the beginning, because our season is weird, where it's blazing hot, and then it's suddenly 20 degrees. So yeah, that I love that. I love the idea of like implementing more and more crops into existing crops, undersowing like that, and then that thing you just talked about with the tomatoes. That's really cool.
Yeah, and it's really amazing. Like, I mean, you think about nature, like, there's definitely sharing going on in those root systems. And when you can have a legume in the mix, it's a polyculture rather than a typical monoculture that we have with market farming. And we can achieve it through rotation. But the way I see it is, like, if I have the seed from the legume standpoint, then, like, I can be constantly kind of creating every bed in a way that it becomes kind of a cover crop. And then if I really give it the year of cover cropping, like we spoke, I can start to like get to where I have a circular fertility system. And the benefits are, like, when I grow tomatoes with fava beans, it's like, it almost like, where you're oftentimes side dressing tomatoes, they tend to find their balance without that. I mean, we're not seeing any nutrient deficiencies, and those greenhouse soils that we have. I mean, the one greenhouse, we've been in production for 6 years, and I mean, we've got like 6% organic matter below 12 inches in there, and like 11% organic matter on the surface. And this past year, we ran, that whole crop without any added fertility. It's just incredible. Because then you're almost running, if you're starting to get to where your profitability is so much higher, especially when for us, we just don't have that cheap source of nutrition. And we're also kind of always thinking about like how much we rely on industrial waste to run our farm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to be thinking about that stuff, because it's, it's not overall sustainable. If we set up a system that's not going to exist in 50 years, or it's just, reliant on a poisonous system, that's not helpful.
No, it's not. Yeah, and interesting too within there is we've been in the same greenhouse. I've been continuously cropping tomatoes since we started there. Usually with like either those fava beans, peas with early greens before the tomatoes in that rotation, and then undersow the tomatoes with fava beans about in August. I'll just like go down the drip lines and just stick fava beans in there. But what we found was, because this greenhouse kind of lays below one of our irrigation ditches, we're kind of getting some wet feet on the one side of the greenhouse where I've got this trowel going, and it was starting to make late blight and like basically oomycete problems that we get in tomatoes happen, which actually was bad from a production standpoint, but great because I was able to, through continuously doing this, we would start to see like this late blight coming on these rows and find the resistance genes to the point of like it killing the whole row except for a few plants, and then coming back the next year and seeing there, with the exact same rotation, there be no affected plants. And then I sent seeds out to my mother who's in Virginia. That's where I'm from, and she was like the only person with tomatoes in like her county or little town that survived the late blight this year.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's so humid in this area, and yeah, late blight and early blight are both like two really common destroyers of tomatoes here.
Yeah, I've just had like, basically like, because we're starting with all this diverse genetics, we have all this potential there for finding hidden genes. But it's been pretty fun because eventually I plan to do a scaled grow here, hopefully with geothermal soil heating, and hopefully I'll have the disease genes for our region already bred from constantly cropping these rows, because I plan to do a rotation there to keep it from being a problem. But it's amazing what breeding can do. It's it gets me fired up to go to work every day.
Well, Casey Piscura, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. It's great to be here, and thanks for doing the podcast. I was just turned on to you guys, and you're doing great work.
All right, if you enjoyed that episode, make sure to follow Casey on Facebook and Instagram, or check out their website, wildmountainseeds.com. We will hook it up with some links in the show notes. Also, check out those events that I mentioned. You can always keep up with us at no-tillgrowers.com. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you're getting it. Leave a review, but when you're reviewing it, make sure to pretend that you're reviewing Radiolab so that when people read it, they'll be like, wow, this podcast sounds really professional. I should check it out. Big thank you, as always, to Jackson Roulette for the enormous amount of work he does to keep all this stuff rolling. Also, shout out and thanks to Josh Satin for all the work he does for our YouTube page. You can find us, No Till Growers. We have a YouTube channel. And you can also check out Josh's too. It's great. Josh Satin. And of course, big thank you to my wife, Hannah Crabtree, for being amazing and making this thing possible. Literally would not happen without Hannah. Of course, thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.
I think it's awesome. You're like picking up where the great Chris Blanchard left off. I mean, I was like religious about listening to all those podcasts, and it's like it's valuable to open up all this stuff so we're not all making the same mistakes. That's really good.